40 seconds. That's how long the phone call lasted before my former CEO realized he had just destroyed his own career. I had just sold my company for $20 million. The papers were signed. The money would hit my account in a few days. I thought the hardest part was finally over. But when my lawyer finished reviewing the contract, he didn't congratulate me. Instead, he said something strange. "Before you celebrate," he said, "call your former CEO and tell him you lost the money." I thought he was joking. Why would I tell anyone I had just lost $20 million? But my lawyer looked completely serious. And that phone call ended up exposing something my former CEO had been hiding for years. Back in my lawyer's office, Michael slid the acquisition agreement across the desk. 8 pages of signatures, 2 years of work, $20 million on the line. If everything closed on schedule, the first wire would hit my account within days. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. Then Michael said, "Your former CEO." The room went quiet. "You want me to call Grant Kellerman?" "Yes." "Why?" Michael leaned back in his chair. "When he answers," he said, "tell him the deal collapsed." I frowned. "What?" "Tell him you lost the $20 million. I stared at him. Why would I lie about that? Michael opened a thin folder and turned one of the pages toward me. Printed emails. Some from me. Some from Grant. "You told me Grant promised you the director of operations role if you completed the Aurora project," Michael said. "He did. And when the project succeeded, he gave the job to someone else." I nodded. "That's why I left." Michael tapped the email. "Daniel, your CEO didn't just break his word." My stomach tightened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the legal picture around Aurora may be more complicated than Grant thinks." I frowned. "Aurora was built at North Star." "Yes," Michael said, "but parts of the architecture trace back to work you designed. Work the company may never have formally secured." I felt my pulse rise. "That can't be what this is." "Maybe not," he said. "But if Grant believes you just lost $20 million, he may panic." Michael closed the folder. "And when men like Grant panic," he said quietly, "they reach for control." The plan began forming in my head. "That you want him to expose himself?" Michael nodded. "Exactly." He slid my phone across the desk. "Call him." I looked down at the screen. Grant Kellerman. For 7 years, he called me indispensable. The man who kept everything running, right up until the moment he handed my promotion to someone else. Michael folded his hands. "If I'm wrong, nothing happens," he said. "And if you're right," I asked. He gave a small smile. "Then Grant will tell us exactly what he's afraid of." I stared at the phone for one more second. Then I hit dial. Before I tell you what Grant said when he picked up that call, you need to understand what those years at North Star actually looked like. Because what happened between us didn't begin with that phone call. It began with a promise. When I joined North Star Precision, the company was growing faster than its systems could handle. We manufactured precision components for medical devices, which meant when production failed, clients noticed immediately. On paper, I was hired as a systems engineer. At North Star, I was usually the only woman in the engineering room. At 35, I thought I finally understood how companies really worked. In practice, I became the person people called when something important broke. Scheduling system crashes at midnight. "Call Daniel. Supplier data corrupted before a production run. Danielle will fix it." A shipment delay threatening 2 factories. "Someone wake Danielle up." For a while, I didn't mind. I liked solving problems. Systems made sense to me in a way corporate politics never did. At North Star, that made me useful. And eventually, people stop thanking useful people. They just start expecting them. About 2 years into my time there, the company began planning something bigger. They called it the Aurora Optimization Program. Aurora was designed to connect supplier logistics, machine diagnostics, and delivery forecasting into a predictive system. If it worked, factories could detect failures before they happened. If it worked, it would save the company millions. Grant Kellerman introduced the project during a leadership meeting. Later that afternoon, he walked over to my desk. "Daniel," he said quietly, "I want you to lead Aurora." I looked up. "Lead it? Yes, this project is critical. If we pull it off, it changes everything." "Why me?" Grant smiled. "Because you're the only person here who actually understands how all our systems fit together." Then he added the sentence that locked the next 2 years of my life into place. "Deliver Aurora successfully," he said. "And the director of operations role is yours." I asked him to repeat that, and officially mine. He nodded. "You finished this project cleanly," Grant said. and I'll make sure the board approves it. After that conversation, Aurora stopped being a project. It became my life. Nights, rewriting algorithms. Weekends, installing sensors across 3 plants. More than once, I slept on the office couch and went home the next morning in the same shirt. Twice, the entire system nearly collapsed. The first time, a supplier missed a shipment and production stopped across 2 plants. My phone rang at 5:30 a.m. "Daniel," Grant said, "fix this." 14 hours later, the production lines were moving again. Grant called back that evening. "Exactly why I trusted you with Aurora," he said. The second incident came 3 days before a major client audit. When a vendor update corrupted Aurora's forecasting module, when Grant walked into the server room, I'd already been there for hours. "I knew you'd be here," he said. "Give me 6 hours." I told him. It took 8. But when the auditors arrived the next morning, Aurora ran perfectly. After the review, Grant shook my hand in front of the entire operations team. "Outstanding work," he said. Then he leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Keep going," he said quietly. "The director position is coming for the next 18 months. Every major decision I made revolved around that promise. The late nights, the weekends, the constant emergencies, all of it made sense if the future Grant described was real. What I didn't realize back then, Cud, was that the future he promised me had already been given to someone else. The Aurora system launched on a Monday morning. I remember the exact time because I hadn't slept the night before. At 7:42 a.m., the production dashboards lit up across all 3 North Star facilities. Supplier data flowed through the network exactly the way I had designed it. Machine sensors reported diagnostics in real time. Delivery forecasts updated automatically every 15 minutes. For the first time in the company's history, every production line moved in sync. Aurora worked. By noon, our largest client called the operations office, and they didn't ask for Grant, they asked for me. "Daniel," the client's director said over speakerphone, "this system is incredible. We've never seen production data this accurate." I thanked him. But what I felt most in that moment wasn't pride. It was relief. 18 months of late nights and emergency fixes had finally paid off. And in my mind, that meant one thing, the promotion Grant had promised. 2 weeks later, the operations division gathered for the quarterly leadership meeting. Everyone in the room knew Aurora had succeeded. As I walked in, a few engineers slapped my shoulder. "Looks like you're moving upstairs," one of them said. Another laughed. "About time." I smiled politely and took a seat near the front. Grant walked onto the stage a few minutes later, tablet in hand, wearing the confident expression he always used before making an announcement. "Before we begin the performance review," he said, "I'd like to recognize a leadership transition within the operations division." My pulse quickened. "This role will guide the next phase of Aurora's expansion," he continued. Several people around the table glanced in my direction. I sat a little straighter. Then he said the name. "I'm pleased to announce our new director of operations, Marissa Cole." For a moment, the room didn't move. Marissa stood from the second row. For a second, I thought she was just stepping aside for someone else. Then she walked toward the stage. She had joined North Star only 3 months earlier. She spoke well in meetings, understood executive language, and seemed perfectly comfortable around senior leadership. But Aurora wasn't her system. Not a single sleepless night of it. She walked to the stage smiling like the announcement had never been in doubt. Grant shook her hand. People began clapping, some out of confusion, some because they didn't know what else to do. I didn't clap. I didn't move. I just sat there while something inside me went completely quiet. When the applause faded, Grant started explaining how Marissa would lead the next phase of Aurora integration. She thanked everyone and promised to continue the incredible work already started. Started, not built, started. After the meeting, a couple engineers stopped me near the exit. "That was supposed to be you," one of them said quietly. Another shook his head. "This doesn't make any sense." But standing there, watching Grant laugh with Marissa across the room, it finally did. Aurora had never been about rewarding the person who built it. It had been about keeping that person useful long enough for someone else to take the credit. And by the time I walked out of that room, I knew one thing for certain. I didn't confront Grant in the hallway. I didn't argue during the meeting, and I didn't make a scene. Instead, I walked back to my desk, opened my laptop, and reread the email he had sent 18 months earlier. Subject, Aurora Project Leadership. The message was short. Complete Aurora successfully, and the Director of Operations role will be yours. There it was, in writing. For a moment, I considered fighting it, forwarding the email to HR, escalating it to the board, forcing the conversation in front of everyone. But the truth had already settled in. People who break promises that easily don't rediscover integrity just because you argue harder. So instead of writing a complaint, I wrote 2 sentences, I printed them, then I walked to Grant's office. He was on the phone when I stepped in, pacing slowly behind his desk. When he saw me, he raised one finger, his signal to wait. I didn't. I placed the envelope on his desk and turned to leave. "Daniel, hold on," he said, ending the call. "What's this my resignation?" He opened the envelope and scanned the page. His eyes moved across the letter once. Then he read it again. The color drained from his face. "You're joking." "I'm not." Grant leaned back in his chair as if the room had shifted under him. "You can't leave," he said. "Why not?" "Because Aurora just launched," he said, his voice tightening. "You're the only person who understands how that system actually works." I let the words hang in the air. "Apparently not." Grant stood up. "Daniel, don't do this. You're upset about the announcement. I get that, but decisions like that happen at multiple levels. Did the email come from multiple levels too?" I asked quietly. I slid my phone across the desk. The message was open on the screen. Grant stared at it for a long moment. His jaw tightened. "That wasn't a formal offer," he said finally. "You misunderstood the context." Something inside me settled into place. "So the plan was always the same, but I said, have me build Aurora, then hand it to someone else." "You're being emotional," Grant replied. "You're essential to this company. People like you are the backbone of operations." "People like me, yes. Reliable, consistent, the kind who keep the engine running while someone else takes credit for driving it." Grant lowered his voice. "Marissa isn't ready to run Aurora yet. The clients depend on you. Stay through the transition and we'll work something out." I shook my head. "That sounds like your problem." His expression hardened. "If you walk out now, Daniel, don't expect a reference from this company." I met his eyes. "I'll take my chances." Grant gripped the resignation letter so tightly the paper crumpled in his hand. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked scared. And in that moment, I understood something. Grant Kellerman wasn't panicking because I was leaving. He was panicking because the moment I walked out that door, he lost control of the one system his entire reputation now depended on. And I was about to walk out anyway. For 3 months after leaving Northstar, I didn't think about Grant Kellerman at all. Not because I had forgiven what happened, but because I was finally building something that belonged to me. Aurora had taught me a lesson. If you're going to work that hard for something, it should probably be yours. Long before Aurora became a company project, I'd been developing a smaller logistics model on my own time. The framework was simpler, but the core idea was the SAM predict problems before they happened. After leaving Northstar, I rebuilt that independent version from scratch and turned it into a real product. 6 months later, a mid-sized logistics software company offered to acquire it. 2 weeks later, I was sitting across from my lawyer, staring at a final agreement worth $20 million. I thought the story ended there. Michael didn't. He closed the contract folder and looked at me. "Daniel, can I ask you something about Aurora?" "What about it? Did you ever sign an intellectual property assignment for that system?" I thought back through everything I had signed at Northstar, then shook my head. "No." Michael nodded slowly. "That's what I suspected." A faint unease moved through me. "Why does that matter?" He opened another folder. Inside were printouts from Northstar's public announcements, all presenting Aurora as a major company asset. "Grant Kellerman is treating Aurora like it's unquestionably Northstar's," Michael said. "Well, it is company technology," I replied automatically. Michael slid another sheet across the desk. It was one of my old emails from the early days of the project. Attached was the original architecture diagram. My name sat clearly at the bottom. Michael chose his next words carefully. "If Aurora's underlying design was never properly assigned, Northstar's ownership position may be weaker than Grant thinks." I stared at him. "That can't be right." "Maybe not," Michael said. "But if Grant has been presenting Aurora as a clean company asset, he may be standing on a dangerous assumption." I looked back at the documents. Aurora had become the backbone of Northstar's operations. Grant had built his reputation around it. Michael tapped the acquisition contract again. "That's why I want you to call him," he said. "But why the phone call?" I asked. Michael gave a small smile. "Because right now your former CEO thinks you're powerless. $20 million changes that, he said. The moment you have resources, you stop looking like a former employee and start looking like a legal problem. He tapped the acquisition agreement. But if Grant Kellerman believes you just lost $20 million, he let the sentence hang. There's a good chance he'll panic. And men like Grant don't panic quietly. I understood the plan immediately. You want him to try locking down Aurora? Michael nodded. Exactly. He slid my phone across the desk. Call him and tell him you lost the money. Because if Grant Kellerman believed I was desperate again, he might make the one move that proved exactly how much Aurora and I were really worth. I stepped out of Michael's office and dialed Grant. Grant answered on the third ring. Danielle. His voice sounded exactly the same as I remembered, calm, controlled, faintly impatient. For a second, I almost hung up. Then I remembered Michael sitting across from me in that quiet office, the folder of documents, the plan. Something happened. I said, a short pause. What do you mean, the acquisition deal I mentioned? It collapsed. Another pause. The buyer pulled out during due diligence. I let the silence sit before finishing. I lost the 20 million. For a moment, there was nothing. Not confusion, calculation. I could almost picture Grant in his glass office at North Star. Realizing the situation had changed, finally he spoke. That's unfortunate. The sympathy sounded practiced. I imagine that changes a few things for you, such as, but maybe this gives us an opportunity, he said, for what to fix things between us. I said nothing. You're a talented engineer. Danielle. Everyone at North Star knows that. Engineer, not creator. Engineer. If you're reconsidering your next move, he continued, there might still be a place for you here. Doing what Aurora is entering its expansion phase. Marissa is handling strategy, but she'll need someone with your technical familiarity. Technical familiarity. So, you want me back? Potentially, Grant said carefully, but there are a few loose ends we'd need to clear up first. What kind of loose ends? I heard the faint tapping of keys. You should receive an email in a moment, he said. 2 seconds later, my phone buzzed. Subject, Aurora Clarification Agreement, 6 pages, 6. The document stated that Aurora and all related architecture were the sole intellectual property of North Star Precision Systems. Further down, another clause required me to waive any claim to the system's design. If you sign that, Grant said smoothly, we can talk about bringing you back. He paused. You've had a rough few months. Losing that kind of money can shake anyone. Another pause. This might be a good time to settle things cleanly. 6 pages, 1 signature. And Aurora would officially become Grant Kellerman's story. I'll review it, I said. Good. Grant replied quietly. And Danielle, I'm glad you called. The line went dead. I forwarded the email to Michael. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. That, he said calmly, is exactly what I needed. Michael didn't waste time. Less than 24 hours after Grant sent the agreement, a formal legal notice arrived at North Star Precision Systems. Inside a corporate boardroom, it didn't need to be dramatic. The notice listed 3 facts. Danielle Carter had never signed an intellectual property assignment covering the Aurora system. Aurora's core architecture had been originally designed and documented by Danielle Carter, and any claim that the technology belonged exclusively to North Star could expose the company to legal liability. At the bottom was one final sentence. We request immediate clarification from the North Star board regarding the ownership status of the Aurora optimization system. That was enough. 48 hours later, Grant Kellerman was called into an emergency board meeting, and so was I. The boardroom looked familiar. Same long table, same glass wall overlooking the factory floor, but the atmosphere was very different. 3 board members sat at the table with the CFO and 2 corporate attorneys. Grant sat near the head of the table, calm as ever. When I walked in, he even smiled. Daniel, he said casually, good to see you. Michael ignored him. He set his laptop on the table and waited. One of the board members spoke first. Mr. Kellerman, we've received a legal inquiry regarding Aurora's intellectual property. Grant leaned back in his chair. There's nothing to clarify, he said smoothly. Aurora was developed as part of North Star's internal operations strategy. Michael opened his laptop. The screen at the end of the room lit up. Let's start here. An email appeared. Subject Aurora Architecture Draft. Danielle Carter. The document contained the original system framework, and at the bottom my name. Michael clicked again. Another email appeared, this one written by Grant. Danielle built the framework. We'll keep the board discussion focused on leadership. Grant leaned forward slightly. Danielle contributed to the system, he said calmly. But Aurora was developed inside North Star. The company funded the entire project. Michael didn't raise his voice, and that would normally be correct. He said, except Ms. Carter never signed an intellectual property assignment for the underlying architecture. Grant's expression tightened. Michael reached into his folder. Without another word, he placed a document on the table. The room went quiet. One of the board members picked it up and began reading. Halfway down the page, she stopped. She looked up slowly. Mr. Kellerman. She turned the document toward the others. This agreement was sent yesterday. Her voice remained calm. But it requires Ms. Carter to waive any future claim to Aurora's design. Another director frowned. Why would that be necessary? He asked quietly. If the company already owned the system, Grant reached for the document. For the first time that morning, his hand wasn't steady. The board chair spoke before his fingers touched the paper. Leave it where it is. Mr. Kellerman. Grant froze. This is being misrepresented, he said quickly. Aurora was developed under my leadership. The company funded the entire. One of the board members interrupted. Mr. Kellerman, she said calmly, tapping the printed email on the table. The issue isn't who funded the project. She turned the page so the entire room could see the message on the screen. The issue is that you already knew who built it. Grant opened his mouth again, then closed it. Around the table, no one spoke. Inside a boardroom, silence can weigh more than an admission. By the end of that week, Grant Kellerman had been placed on administrative leave. 3 days later, after an emergency legal review, North Star announced his termination as CEO. Officially, the reason was leadership misconduct and inaccurate corporate reporting. Unofficially, everyone inside the company knew exactly what had happened. The man who built his reputation on Aurora had just been undone by the person who actually built it. About a month after Grant Kellerman was removed as CEO, my phone rang again. This time, the number belonged to North Star's board office. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then curiosity won. Danielle Carter speaking? A calm voice answered. Ms. Carter, this is Elaine Porter from the North Star board. I leaned back in my chair. Yes, we wanted to speak with you about Aurora and the future of the operations division. I didn't respond. She continued. The board has completed its internal review. It's clear now that your work was central to the system's success. That was the closest thing to an apology I expected. Then she said something I hadn't anticipated. We would like to offer you the position of Director of Operations. The title hung in the air. The same position I had spent nearly 2 years working toward. Elaine continued. The compensation package includes a significant salary increase, a signing bonus, and equity participation in Aurora's expansion. I looked out the window of my office. 3 months earlier, hearing those words would have meant everything to me. Now they felt distant. Elaine waited. So, she asked gently, what do you think? I took a slow breath. Then I answered, no. There was a brief silence. May I ask why she said? I glanced around the office, and the glass wall behind me displayed the name of the company I had started after leaving North Star. 7 employees, 7 clients. And growing every week. Because, I said quietly, I already built something better. Elaine didn't argue. She wished me well and ended the call. 3 months later, the company I started was growing faster than I expected. The predictive logistics system we built began attracting attention across the industry. Clients started calling, then referrals followed. Within a single quarter, we signed 7 major contracts. One of them used to be North Star's largest manufacturing client. I heard a few things about Grant over the next couple of months. Nothing official, of course. News like that travels quietly. The board's internal review had raised more questions about how Aurora had been presented to investors. Once those questions started circulating, Grant's reputation moved through the industry faster than any press release. By the time winter arrived, I was told he was consulting for a much smaller firm outside Chicago, a long way from the glass office he once ran at North Star. Apparently, they preferred working with the person who actually understood the system. A few weeks later, I met Michael Reed for coffee, the same quiet cafe where we had first discussed the acquisition. He stirred his coffee slowly and looked at me. So, he said, did you really lose $20 million? I smiled. No. Michael raised an eyebrow. Seems like you came out ahead. I leaned back in my chair. I didn't lose 20 million. I paused. I just stopped working for someone who thought my work belonged to him. Have you ever worked under a boss who tried to take credit for what you built? If you were Danielle, what would you have done? Would you go back to North Star as director or walk away and build your own company? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about office drama, corporate betrayal, and people finally reclaiming what they built, you may want to stick around here. There are many more stories like this coming.